Recently, I've noticed an odd gap in online information sources about the development of writing systems. There are some that talk about how writing first began from nothing, or discuss the history and use of certain individual systems, or follow an individual letter on its way through multiple alphabets, but not the evolution of entire alphabets at a time. And in the big picture, the patterns you'd find would bring more order to the chaos and even make these whole alphabets start to look like variations of a single system, which would not only be more interesting, but also make it easier to learn how to use foreign alphabets and pronounce foreign words. So it's unfortunate that nobody brings it all together and shows the big picture. Well, now I'm here to change that. So I'm starting not at the oldest writing, but centuries later at the most recent common ancestor of the alphabets that most of the modern world uses, the Phoenician one. It has 22 letters, so I put them in 22 boxes, and I'll add later alphabets letters in the same boxes with the Phoenician ones they came from. There was always some variation in letter shapes, just like today with different people's handwriting, but maybe even more than that because there wasn't as much of a way to standardize. Different writers in different places and times didn't have as much of a way to interact with each other and make sure they all still had the same concept of what any given letter should look like. So in some boxes, I've included more than one version to make later developments easier to see, but both versions in the same box are still the same letter, at least in Phoenician. The Phoenician alphabet isn't used anywhere anymore, but several modern alphabets evolved from it, starting with its two earliest offshoots, the Aramaic and Greek alphabets. The idea spread from the Phoenicians to the Aramaeans easily because they lived right next to each other. Greece was farther away, but both Greek and Phoenician cultures did a lot of sailing and colonizing in the same sea, so they ran into each other a lot as if they were neighbors anyway. The Aramaic alphabet, which I'm adding below the Phoenician letters now, is a straightforward continuation of the same 22 letters, just with the shapes continuing to drift. That was simple because those two languages were closely related and had mostly the same sounds. But adapting it for Greek was more complicated because Greek was unrelated to them and had a different set of sounds. And for now, I'm only going to talk about the sounds of Ancient Greek, not what they've evolved into in modern Greek, which I will get to later. First of all, in the transition to Greek, roughly half of the letters kept pretty much their original sounds with little or no change because those were sounds that Greek had in common with the other two. That includes at least da, ga, ba, za, la, ma, na, something like ra or ra, and ta, pa, and ka, which is where we reach our first complication because two versions of this letter in Greek ended up as two separate letters for two separate sounds. Or at least technically, we don't have an ancient Greek document where anybody wrote that he made the decision to make two letters out of one, but that's what seems to have happened from the way they were used. Greek voiceless plosives, which means ta, pa, and ka, each had an aspirated counterpart, which means they get an extra bit of air pushed out with them, as in ta, pa, and ka instead of ta, pa, and ka. Aspirating a plosive is something that English speakers do routinely under some circumstances, but we aren't usually conscious of it because ka and ka don't count as two separate sounds in English, but they did in ancient Greek, and Phoenician had no letters for the aspirated ones. So at first there was just one letter for both Greek sounds in this pair, but a couple of the visual styles it could appear in, with some of its parts rotated differently, ended up getting associated with the two different sounds. So then the two forms of the letter worked like two separate letters and started being called two separate letters. On top of that, there were also some other Greeks who used this new letter for yet another variation from the plain original ka, with a sa in the place of the ha effect. So to them it represented not ka, but ksa. But that use for it ended when all Greeks standardized on using this letter for the aspirated ka. That makes this pair of letters our first example of a general rule we'll see repeatedly. The main way new letters get created for sounds that weren't previously represented is modification of the old letter for the sound that came closest to the sound that needed a new letter. People could just as well invent completely new letters with no connection to old ones, or modify other random letters regardless of how different the original sound was, but they normally don't. They start drawing a letter with a similar sound slightly differently to mark a slight difference in its usage, and then that difference ends up making it work like a new letter. And once a letter splits like this, usually either they stay right next to each other in the alphabetical order, or, as in this case, one gets bumped to the end of the alphabet, after the original final letter, tau. This Phoenician letter originally represented the sound of English Y as a consonant, as in words like yard and yell. That's really pretty much the same thing as a vowel like E or I, just short and followed by another vowel. So the consonant and vowel sounds don't really need to be two separate letters, and aren't in some systems. The Phoenicians originally didn't use letters for vowel sounds, so this was just another consonant to them, but the Greeks' main use for it was as a vowel. The Phoenicians also eventually agreed that it would be a good idea to represent vowel sounds, at least sometimes, and started using this letter both ways, like how we use our unrelated letter Y, so it inherited both functions in Aramaic. Mostly the same kind of thing is also true for this one. It started as just the Phoenician letter for the consonant sound wa, like English W, but also ended up, at least sometimes, representing the vowel sound oo in all three of these ancient languages. It was exclusively a vowel to some Greeks, but some other Greeks did think the equivalent consonant should be treated as separate from that, which led to roughly the same sequence of events as with kappa and chi. With no standardization in letter shapes, it was free to take on different forms, with parts of it rotated differently, which became associated with its two different sounds, so they came to be thought of as two separate letters, and the one for the vowel sound oo got bumped to the end of the alphabet. Later on, the Greeks would all agree that they didn't need a letter for that consonant sound wa after all, so that one fell out of use, leaving nothing in this original spot in alphabetical order. And here's one more consonant that also got turned into a Phoenician vowel. The original consonant sound for this one is something that doesn't count as any kind of sound in most European languages, and most speakers would even think of it as a lack of a sound, a gap between sounds. It sometimes shows up in English words where we think of something else as having gone silent, such as turning flatten into flatten, which goes even farther in some parts of England, such as turning digital and water bottle into digital and water bottle. Most of us also do it at the beginning or end of some words, but it's not as easy to clearly illustrate there. In Semitic languages like Phoenician and Aramaic, that break between sounds counts as a sound and gets its own letter. Of course, that doesn't sound like any particular vowel, like how ya and wa sounded like e and u, but it became associated with a in those languages anyway, and thus in Greek as well, because that was the most common next sound after it, like in the names of the city Beit She'an in Israel and the Muslim holy book, Quran, as well as the beginning of the letter's name, Aleph or Aleph, which ended up as alpha in Greek. And that's it for letters that are used as vowels in Semitic languages, because that's all of the vowel sounds that those spoken languages consistently distinguish. But Greek still had more vowel sounds left, and Phoenician still had more non-Greek consonants left. This consonant is especially troublesome for most outsiders. It's produced by continuously breathing out while voicing and slightly constricting the throat as low as possible, which creates something like ah. Although native speakers of Semitic languages apparently say outsiders never get it right. So here's a Wikipedia sound sample of a native speaker doing it.
Ah.
Thank you. As far as the Greeks were concerned, there was no such consonant sound, and it even sounded oddly weak and vowely anyway, so they used the letter, with another split into two, for a couple of O vowels, one long and one short. Their names tell you which one was which. Omicron for the one on the left and Omega for the one on the right literally mean small o and large O. And of course, once there were two letters there, one of them had to go to the back of the line. There's also another type of vowel sound which came in long and short versions in ancient Greek, and it's the vowel sound that they heard in the names of a pair of similar Phoenician letters, chet and he. To the Phoenicians, that e vowel sound in these letters' names was the same thing as the I in Aleph, but to the Greeks it was different, so they needed a letter for it, or two if they were to distinguish based on length. As Phoenician consonants, chet represented cha, which is made with throat constriction as low as possible, just like that last one, but unvoiced, and he represented ha, the same as our letter H. Greek only had one of those two sounds, so they both sounded pretty much the same to them, so the one in the blue box was immediately put to use as a vowel in Greek. But then different Greek writers had different ideas about what to do with chet, the one in the yellow box. One interpretation was as the closest Greek consonant, ha, like our letter H, including putting it after the letters for ka and pa to indicate aspirated plosives ka and pa. The other Greek interpretation for chet was as the long vowel e or a, as opposed to its short counterpart in the blue box. For a while, both uses of this letter coexisted, with different Greek cities favoring one over the other, and the letter could be called either heta or eta. But assigning either sound to this letter meant not having a letter for the other sound. In the compromise, which ended up as standard, we get another split, this time not into two letters, but into a letter and a diacritic. Diacritics are extra little symbols that usually float above or below a letter and indicate a slight modification of that letter's sound. In this case, while the letter ended up representing the long vowel e, a smaller, simplified version of it, without its right vertical stroke, became a diacritic, which adds the sound ha to the letter that it floats above. So, for example, putting it above a letter for I or U turns it into he or hu. It's considered not a separate sound, but a way of pronouncing the letter that it's attached to, called rough breathing as opposed to smooth breathing. The fact that the letter rho can receive it indicates that ancient Greek also had a rough version of that sound, which got romanized as RH in Greek words that got exported to other languages. But this form of the symbol isn't used anymore. It lost another one of its segments, and the remaining corner got rounded off, yielding its modern form called a dacia. And reversing the dacia yields another diacritic called a psili for the opposite meaning, smooth breathing, the lack of the ha effect. And that's all for the vowels, even in Greek, but there are still a few consonants left. This letter represents one of a class of sounds in Semitic languages called emphatic consonants, and here is its non-emphatic counterpart. The emphatic effect is created by pharyngealization, which means while making the primary sound, you also constrict your throat, just like I've mentioned with another couple of letters already. So it's like trying to pronounce two separate sounds at the same time. For example, combining that effect with t would make something a bit like tra, although that was rather exaggerated to make it easier to hear. It's really usually so subtle that people who don't natively speak a language that distinguishes sounds in this way might not notice any difference at all. To the ancient Greeks, it sounded similar enough to their aspirated consonant ta to use the letter for that. Also, on the subject of emphatic consonants, chet can be considered the emphatic counterpart of he. These three letters form a group called sibilants, which is named after the Latin word for hissing and includes sa as well as other sounds close to it like sha or sha or tsa or sha or sha. You could also include their voiced counterparts like za and ja, but in this case we're only dealing with the unvoiced ones. The letter in the yellow box is called shin and seems to have originally represented sha, but also came to represent sa as well in Aramaic because of a small difference between the spoken languages, Aramaic and Phoenician, which I'll describe in a moment. Greek had no sha, so both of those Aramaic sounds sounded like sa to them anyway, so that's what shin's Greek form, sigma, represents. The one in blue represents sa in Semitic languages, but its Greek cousin represents the sequence xa, like the Roman letter X. So there's a bit of a mystery about how Phoenician and early Aramaic sibilants sounded. What original sound for the one in the blue box could have led to a plain sa in Semitic languages but ksa in Greek? And why would Aramaic speakers have started using the letter shin in the yellow box for not only its own sound sha, but also the sound sa, which already had its own letter? The answer seems to involve some other Aramaic sibilant sound for which there was no letter because spoken Phoenician didn't have it. Whatever that sound was, the Aramaeans assigned it to the letter shin because there weren't enough letters for them all and the Aramaeans weren't into adding new ones like the Greeks were. But that sound would later shift to merge with sa instead of sha. Finally, the letter in the red box is the emphatic sibilant. In most Semitic languages, it comes out as sa plus the addition of the pharyngeal effect I described earlier, like how most other emphatics work. But there is one language in which it has lost pharyngealization and gained a hard beginning like a Roman letter T, becoming the affricate tsa. The Greeks did keep the letter around at first, named san, but without any emphatics to represent or so many extra sibilants to distinguish, they dropped it fairly soon. So now there's only one letter left for which to talk about significant differences in sound between the Semitic languages and Greek, and it's the wildest ride of them all. Its Semitic sound is a plosive articulated farther back than ka, but higher than the pharyngeal sounds, as if it were an emphatic ka, but the two articulation points were too close to use separately without merging into a single sound articulated between them. So, ka plus ha equals ka. But most or all European languages, including Greek and English, don't have that sound, so it usually seems the same as the plain non-emphatic ka to us. When we spell Semitic words in our alphabet, we can distinguish between these two sounds in writing by using the letter Q for this one, but then we still usually pronounce it like a K anyway. For example, in the name of this city, the Q indicates a pronunciation close to Aqaba, but most of us would say Aqaba as if it had a K there anyway. But even if we treat the letters' sounds as equivalent from the Greek perspective, there's still a difference in their names. In yellow, we have kof or kopa, and in blue, it's kaf or kappa. And that difference in the first vowels in their names is probably why kopa is the one that went through what I'm about to describe. All of the Greek plosives I've talked about so far fit neatly into this table, where the columns group them by where in the mouth they are articulated, and the rows group them by voicing and aspiration. But it would have had a fourth column not long before this alphabet was adopted, for sounds with both a labial component and a velar component, called labiovelars. Right when the Greeks adopted this alphabet, the labiovelar plosives were in the process of disappearing from spoken Greek, and one common way for them to disappear was to become simply labial, merging with any labial plosives which the language already had. So something like gua and qua became ba and pa. This might seem like a strange thing to think would happen, but we know it definitely did for two reasons. First, there's comparison with other languages that are related to Greek, being descended from the same ancestor, a prehistoric language that we now call Proto-Indo-European. Greek labials often correlate with either velars or some combination of labial and velar effects in the equivalent words in other Indo-European languages, which makes sense if they came from the same Proto-Indo-European sounds which once had both components together. The second reason we know that this transition from labiovelars to labials often happened in Greek is because of spellings in another writing system which the Greeks used in the Bronze Age, which we now call Linear B. The end of the Bronze Age was a chaotic time for everybody in the eastern Mediterranean region, during which Linear B fell out of use, so Greece went through a few centuries of illiteracy again before adopting this new alphabet in the Iron Age. And we can see different phonetic versions of the same words in the two writing systems before and after that gap. For example, look at hippos. Linear B had a symbol for the syllable po, but didn't use it in that word. It used another symbol which only shows up in words like these, where it correlates with both labial and velar sounds in other Indo-European languages. So we know the labiovelars existed because Greek writers once had separate letters for them, and they were actually spelling that word as ikos at one time and then hippos later. So, given the fact that that happened, it's not hard to see that if there were real Greek sounds for each spot in this table, then there would be not only an aspirated labial, but also an aspirated labiovelar which had disappeared, often by becoming just labial. And there was, and kopa seemed like the perfect letter to use for it while they still had it. But in this case, the way the letter was drawn already diverged before that sound shift had finished spreading in Greek, while both the old pronunciation and the new pronunciation were still used by different Greek speakers. And the style on the left became associated with the older sound, while the style on the right became associated with the newer sound. So they split into two letters. Then, once the sound shift had finally caught on everywhere, so did the newer sound's letter on the right, so the one on the left had no unique sound left to represent. It lingered for a while, sometimes being used where kappa or kai could have been used when followed by an u or o vowel, but eventually fell out of use because it was redundant. And of course, by that time, one of these two letters had already been bumped to that cluster of new letters at the end after tau. So now I've addressed the origins of 4 of those extras at the end of the Greek alphabet, but there's still one more left, and that's because the evidence doesn't give us much sign of what its origin really was. Like xi, psi represented another sequence of 2 sounds. Psa, like a letter P followed by an S in our alphabet. 2 other letters are similar enough in both appearance and sound to be reasonable candidates for its origin. Many linguists also include chi as a possibility, even though it doesn't look or sound as much like psi as those 2 sibilants do, based on each of them having sometimes taken the other's place in some very early alternative spellings. We also can't rule out that psi was a completely new invention, not derived from anything else, but that seems unlikely because that's just not what the Greeks usually did, and there was no special need for it in this case. This uncertainty means that I can't say that psi definitely belongs in any particular box here and not any other, but I do need to put it somewhere, not just leave it out like it doesn't exist. And I already know that 2 of these boxes will be pretty full later, so I'll just put it in the 3rd one where I know there'll be room for it. And there are still a few more Greek letters that were used for a while in some places in ancient times, but I'm leaving them out because they have no modern descendants, not even in Greek. So now let's focus on how the shapes of the letters evolved in Greek and Aramaic. One general trend is that they were all fairly free to rotate clockwise or counterclockwise back then, and sometimes just parts of a letter would rotate while other parts didn't. Another that both Greek and Aramaic have in common is that letters tend to simplify by losing parts and not get more complicated and sprout new parts. This is a continuation of what had already happened in Phoenician and earlier, because they had started out as pictures and been simplified down to abstract shapes from there. People just don't like drawing more extra detail beyond what's needed to tell the letters apart. But the Greeks and Aramaeans didn't agree on which parts of which letters to drop, and there are some other trends that only happened in one language or the other. All of these look like they got flipped backward in Greek, but not Aramaic. But what really happened is that originally, whole lines of text could flow either right or left, or even back and forth on a single artifact, and each asymmetrical letter's orientation was based on the flow of the line it was in. Then, Phoenician and Aramaic settled on flowing left, but Greek settled on flowing right, and the letters in both cases just got stuck in the form that went with that writing direction. Greek also made these asymmetrical letters symmetrical, whether by rotating them or rotating parts of them, or by lengthening or shortening parts, which meant they'd look the same regardless of which way the text they were in flowed. Aramaic not only left all of those asymmetrical, but also made some originally symmetrical letters asymmetrical, so almost every Aramaic letter ends up asymmetrical. Each of these Phoenician letters included a triangle which got broken open in Aramaic by dropping one of the 3 lines, but preserved in Greek. Some would also almost immediately get a corner rounded off, and later in history we'll see that there are rounded off versions of all of them. And the letters with loops in their Phoenician forms went about the same way. Aramaic broke the loops open by just not drawing the whole thing anymore, and Greek preserved them. There was a letter with a closed rectangle which Greek didn't preserve, but Aramaic didn't either, so Aramaic ended up without any enclosed shapes at all. Going back to the triangles, we can see that they are also examples of another trend. In not just these cases, but also all of these, any stroke that was anywhere near horizontal or vertical in Phoenician gets standardized as strictly vertical or horizontal in Greek, giving Greek letters lots of right angles and a more boxy, rectangular overall style. So the round parts it preserved stood out more. Phoenician and Aramaic had more freedom for their almost vertical and almost horizontal lines to end up getting angled or curved. And those are trends that we will see continuing later on both sides of the family. Here we have 4 Phoenician letters with zigzags in them, where Greek not only preserved the zigzag, but even blew it up so the whole letters became one big zigzag, whereas Aramaic diminished the zigzags, whether by shrinking parts, letting parts disappear, or replacing a pair of back and forth strokes with a single crossing stroke. Greek even made a new zigzag out of a previously non-zigzagged letter. This one might look like an exception because it has a zigzagged form in Phoenician but not Greek. But the Phoenician zigzag was a late development, so it wasn't zigzagged yet when the Greeks adopted it. In fact, even in some computer fonts like Trebuchet, the Greek letter still has its original vertical stroke, although not usually. An overall pattern here so far is that Aramaic tended to lose potential distinguishing features which Greek preserved and used to keep its letters more distinct from each other. Aramaic letters generally boil down to as few strokes and angles as possible, always open-ended, so they get much more like each other. Half of the alphabet ends up as just 2 strokes meeting at an angle, usually in pretty similar orientations. This amount of convergence was a real problem for people using this system because a slight imprecision in drawing a letter could easily make it look like a different letter. So in later systems descended from Aramaic, we'll see different solutions people came up with. Here's an example to demonstrate that these changes were gradual shifts, not sudden radical replacements of one whole rigidly standardized alphabet with another as we might think of it today. Because sometimes we can see an alphabet in use that doesn't look entirely Phoenician, but isn't what you'd expect for Greek or Aramaic either. This is a vase from ancient Corinth depicting Perseus fighting a monster called Ketos to save Andromeda. With Ketos facing right and the people facing left, Ketos' name flows right and the people's names flow left. So I'll flip the people's names backward to make the rest of this easier. And here are their names in modern Greek. The vase has 4 of this letter that looks like a modern beta, but it's actually an epsilon, which in modern Greek looks like our letter E. The fact that epsilon is used in ketos where eta would be used later shows that the long and short versions of that vowel sound weren't assigned to 2 separate letters yet, at least not in Corinth. In the epsilons on the vase, the loose ends are connected with extra arches because the painter just didn't pull the brush away while moving from one tip to the next. Epsilon was free to look like this in Corinth because the Corinthian beta had already taken off in a different direction, but this is what beta looked like in some other places, so this version of epsilon is a dead end. It didn't spread and become standard. Then there are 3 of this letter where sigma would appear today, but this is the letter san, which was derived from a different Phoenician letter from sigma. But because san and sigma represented the same sound in Greek and everybody used just one or the other, not both, and they even looked similar, it was easy to treat them as versions of the same thing and eventually settle on just one of them. San might make you wonder what the Corinthian mu would look like. The spot where mu would be in Andromeda is damaged, so we can't see the whole thing. But 2 short high strokes are visible, which is consistent with a known contemporary version of mu which looked roughly like this, which is also consistent with the vase's version of nu. They're both just a single tall vertical stroke with different lengths of zigzag at the top. The other corner hasn't shifted down to the bottom yet, which means other than mu losing 1 stroke from the zigzag, they're still unchanged from their Phoenician forms. Another suspiciously Phoenician-looking letter for a Greek vase is the pi in Perseus, which has straight horizontal and vertical lines and right angles fitting Greek's more rectangular style, but also still has its Phoenician lopsidedness with one leg shorter than the other, which also makes it easier to see how it could be related to the Roman p. And finally, here's a version of upsilon with the opposite relationship to its modern form from what you might expect. The modern form has remained identical to Phoenician with all 3 strokes intact. And the one on the vase has the later development, the loss of the bottom stroke. That's because the difference is not just about time, but also place. When this vase was made, other cities outside Corinth were still using the original shape for upsilon, and the modern standard form came from one of those other cities, making the Corinthian two-stroke version a dead end in Greece, although it is the one that made it to Italy. So we have text running in both directions, with some ordinary modern-looking Greek letters, a few that seem to still be somewhere between their classically Phoenician and Greek forms, one that wound up getting preserved only in Italy rather than in Phoenician or Greek territory, and a couple of oddballs that didn't make it into a modern standard anywhere, all in 3 Greek names on 1 Greek vase. Here's another example. This time it's just the whole alphabet in order, not words, because the decorative style they were going for included sometimes treating letters as decorations even when there wasn't anything to say. And because it's in alphabetical order, we can see that by this time they've settled on flowing only to the right, not left or back and forth. And we can find all of the differences from either Modern Standard Greek or Roman pretty easily. These letters show changes that would get preserved in the Roman alphabet. These are pretty recognizable as Greek and not Roman, although sometimes a little bit different from Modern Standard Greek. These two show changes that make them look like they don't belong anywhere, and this one looks like the wrong letter because it's somehow retained its Phoenician form. And even though it's definitely some type of Greek overall, it's also missing 2 standard Greek letters. Incidentally, although they thought the alphabet looked cool, most people apparently weren't literate yet. The painter forgot twice whether to include strokes that make a difference between one letter and another, even though both are correct on the other side of the same jug, and apparently also expected to be able to get away with filling in leftover space at the end with things that weren't letters but looked vaguely lettery. Anyway, those are just a couple of quick, easy examples of how blurry the lines between alphabets were at first. Now, those are the alphabets in this family that were used in the Bronze Age and Iron Age. The next step will bring us all the way to the present and fill in these boxes with the modern world's Hebrew, Arabic, Roman, and Cyrillic alphabets. And there might be a third part coming sometime after that with even more alphabets in this same family tree, which I originally intended to include before cutting them for time. But for now, I'm splitting it here to get part 1 out a bit sooner and rein in my video lengths.